Hi, Jeanine. So today I'm speaking with Jeanine Gregersen-Hermans, who will be very familiar to people in lots of different contexts, especially across Europe in particular, through her work with the EAIE and various projects, which are culminating in a book which will be appearing in my series very soon, written with Karen Lauritsen. And the title is Enhancing International Programs in Higher Education, an Educational Development Perspective. So we're going to talk about a range of things today, I hope, Jeanine.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah. So you're famous, shall we say, for discussing intercultural competence and those kinds of perspectives. And I don't want to give too much away with regard to your forthcoming book, but I know you view intercultural competence as being a key graduate attribute, but you don't think we're necessarily very good at articulating and measuring intercultural competence. So maybe you could start with that.
Yeah, well, I think let's start with say first things first. What I always note is that people, when they talk about intercultural competence in, say, in university land in general, is they talk about it like it's something that you can switch on and off, or they talk about it like, you know, you can be happy intercultural on your own. And that's sort of what puzzles me at the moment. It's sort of how do people understand intercultural competence, but then how do they integrate it in their programs? And so I have been working at several places to help universities and say, well, how can we integrate this? And then you see that they try to articulate various notions of what intercultural competence is, and then they use, for instance, Dahler's model, or they come up with Byron's model, or they come up with, say, Hawanini and say, this is learning from the world. But then if you see how they then integrate that into their programs, sometimes you see that they have learning outcomes there. And I've been doing some curriculum analysis, and then you find that there are no associated teaching and learning activities. And the assessment is also that many universities struggle with. And then you see that on the one hand, they have a, how do you say it, they have this certain notion of what intercultural competence is. Then you see the vacuum in the teaching and learning, and that they come up with assessment, sometimes in terms of essays, sometimes they use a measurement instrument, but the linkages between the two, so what they measure in an instrument or in the portfolio, what they're looking for, has no connection to what actually the intercultural competence is that they set out to achieve in their students. So that's why, sort of as part of that book, we also said, well, we need to delineate it and to say, how can we transform really good definitions of intercultural competence that there are out there in the literature? How can we actually articulate that in the form of learning outcomes? And so that's what we have been doing.
And so moving from the strategy which says we want to incorporate intercultural competence into learning outcomes, or at least intended learning outcomes, and then having teaching and learning and assessment processes which enable that to be developed, and therefore measuring it at the individual student level. It's that last bit that I think you're concerned that we're missing.
Yeah, so it's not only the last bit that we're missing. I think it's the whole change, or the whole alignment to what do we want our students to learn, and then having that in a concrete and measurable way integrated into programs, to actually having the teaching and learning activities there that we know can contribute to that learning, and then say, how do we know that the students have achieved it? And how do we know that we are engaging them in this process of learning? Because it's not that you can go, always compare it to running a marathon. If you want to run a marathon, where do you start? You start with the first 100 meters. And then maybe a number of years later, some of us will be able to run the marathon. Not all of us, but some of us will be able to run that. And that whole, say, developmental perspective on intercultural competence, I think that is lacking, say in many places. And what is also lacking is because you can paint it on paper and you can draw the lines on paper, but it is the people in the university, so from people in the strategy office, from people to learning and teaching, from the academics in the field and students, who have to make this a reality and have to co-create it together.
I really like the metaphor of the running the marathon and making it clear that it is a process. I think the one of the problems I've always had with the term intercultural competence, it sounds as though it's switched on or off. You're either competent or you're not competent.
Yeah.
And so that idea that it's got to be built up and there are phases all the way along. I mean, I suppose it brings into question, at what point would you say that somebody is interculturally competent? But we won't go down that route, because we could be arguing forever on that one. So that there will be different phases at which, or at different stages. And I'm not going to go into the developmental model of that whole DMIS thing, because that's a different discussion altogether. But it's very interesting, because you've had a lot of practical experience, haven't you? You've been in, you've worked in lots of universities, partly through your various projects on the intercultural classroom and the Equip project. So you've worked with people from lots of different countries. And how do you see that working in different places? You mentioned the relationships between students and the relationships between academics, and helping them to develop their fields as well.
Yeah. Well, I think, first of all, sort of to follow on a little bit from the previous discussion, I think it's important to understand also that intercultural competence is contextual. So if you say, you know, we don't go in the developmental model and whatever, that's fine. And it's difficult to how do you say it, to say when is somebody intercultural competent. I think that it is situational. So in some instances, and you will recognize it, at least I recognize it, in some instances I think, oh, I did that great. And then in some instances I thought, well, actually, no, I should really think and do this better next time. And I think if you have that approach, and then going back to your question, it is taking what is there, what are the strengths, what are the perspectives of people in their own situation, in their local context, and looking what is relevant there, what are the issues that they are struggling with. Because in some countries, in the one example that I have close at mind, for instance, in India, you have a different societal context, and then where you have different ways of access to higher education, different access to resources. So their intercultural competence is not so much framed as relating between peoples in different nations or whatever, but it is really much more focused on how do we deal with society, with inequality in society and lack of social justice. And then you get a very different context for intercultural competence development. And it's working with what is there. And the other example that I think is really telling is when I worked a lot in Oman. And Oman is in a sense, a really beautiful country, and see what is happening there. It's an open society with a very large mix of cultures in there. And you see the Omani government really working at integrating, but also maybe even more involving the Omanis in how society runs. And if you take that from as your starting point when you think about intercultural competence and integrating that into higher education, you get immediately a different notion again, because then it's not about social inequality or social justice. It is about building, say an open society that can engage with other areas and other countries in the world. And so everywhere you go, you will have that different notion.
And
so
I think we tend to, those of us in the international education field, we tend to associate intercultural competence with something which is international, as it were. But you've just made a very good point there about in Oman, for example, the diversity of domestic society, as it were, and many of us certainly across Europe are facing a situation where we've got very diverse populations within our own context. So the skills and developments and the kind of capabilities, shall we say, that are needed in different countries are equally needed within our own countries and our own contexts, aren't they? Especially when we're looking at if we're living in a big city or something like that, where the population is very diverse, and we often forget about that local diversity, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's for me sort of sitting at sort of in my thinking. I can really see a shift, and I say, well, if you want to be international, and having that global outlook, it's really important that you understand the local context, and that there is a dynamic between, say, the local and the global that we need to bridge, and that is, I think, the key of what students need to start to understand. And if we talk about students, that whatever they do in their local context, and whether they have an international career or they stay home in the city that they are born in, is that what happens out there impacts what happens to them, but also their choices and their behaviors influence what happens to other people. And that interdependency, I think, is a key element. I think when you talk about intercultural communication, that it always is about this relationship between people. So yes, it is a graduate attribute, but it is about also relating to other people.
And so one of the big issues that I think comes out in the whole world, basically every country in the world, is that if you've got international students and domestic students, the difficulty of so-called engagement of the, if you see them as separate groups, which is another debate altogether, but the people do complain that domestic students stay in silos, international students stay in silos, and how can we get them to engage with each other? And of course, if we're going to be working on the experience of intercultural competence development, we need that engagement, or that engagement is going to help a lot in its development. What's your view on that then?
Yeah, well, I think that is exactly where I sit at this point. So went back to teaching, and one of the things that I teach is intercultural competence development, but also things like critical thinking and digital citizenship and ethics and all of that stuff. And for me, that was really, in a way, a humbling experience, because I have all these lofty ideas about what is important for them. And then they smile at me and they think, oh, there you have this nice lady, and she's talking about this so passionately. But for them, what matters to them is will my life be? Who will I be? Will I manage? Will I be capable? Will I be able to settle? So I have learned over the past year to really sort of frame all of the things that I am so passionate about, to frame that in words and context and examples that is relevant for the students, who are really very down to earth. Yes, they know all these things, but for them it is what's in it for me, sort of, and why should they be bothered, sort of, because their life goes on as it goes on, and they socialize, they have their fun, they have their beer. What are you talking about? That is what I often get. So that is my challenge at the moment, is actually to drag them and say, well, if you want to do whatever business in Asia or whatever they're focusing on, read a newspaper. Sort of, there is a Chinese daily that you can read in English. There is an whatever Hindustan Times you can read. Just to start them, try and interest them in what is happening in the world. And each time I say, well, how does this relate? We had an example in the first block of this year where we talked about sustainability, and I asked them the question, because sustainability for me is really a part of, say, also having that intercultural mindset. I said, you just look around you so that was a reflective question, and I asked them to write about what do you see in your environment, how climate change is affecting the world around you, sort of in your own village, in your own city, in your own town. And it was very hard for them to answer that question. Where I said, well, just open your window, look outside. We have a very dry summer. We have already 2 years lack of rain why is this happening? And these really simple observations, they had difficulty in making them. They said, so, well, we should eat less meat, but you know what? And, I travel too much, but everybody's doing that. So that, in a sense, I think is where the key sits, is actually making it relevant to students. And having that fun conversation with them, not being sort of up there and saying you should, but sitting next to them.
I just wanted to touch on the subtitle of your book, an educational development perspective. And another thing I know you've said to me is that educational development means different things in different contexts. And I've been around long enough to remember when educational development first started being talked about in the way it is, and some degree of resentment from academics who thought, leave me alone, let me get on with my discipline and whatever. But you see it interpreted in different ways, I think, in different countries.
Yeah, there's two learning experiences there, both from, say, the project that we did preceding to the book, and when we started thinking about educational development and having, what does it mean in internationalization, and in the Equip project, and I know you'll reference it for the people, we really found out that this is not, say, a job or a function, it's more a role that people take. And that where you go into universities like in the Netherlands or in Denmark or in the UK or US, if you will, people understand what it is. But in the other partners in the Equip project, it was not so much a function, it was maybe a role that people, say senior academics in a university, took on, and when they were responsible for developing a curriculum. So that on the one hand, so that it has a wide, say, variety of how it is implemented or even articulated in the world. And what we learned from writing the book, and we invited a number of really good people with senior experience in educational development, only they didn't recognize that they were educational developers as we defined it, because they didn't know the term. So they wrote about how they constructed their curriculum, how they took students at the center, how internationalization put a place on that. But when we asked them to give feedback on things that we developed in Equip, say like the ideal competency profile of a educational developer, it came back blank because they didn't understand the concept. And we had one case study from Costa Rica. And that what was written in there was, say, well, we do all the things that you talk about, but we never use these words. We never use curriculum design. We never use intended international learning outcomes. We don't think about creating authentic international experiences. It is just who we are. And I think that I think that is, for me, also one of the joys of writing this book, that you are confronted also with your own silo and your own frame of thinking, and understand that there is so much out there that we don't know yet.
Absolutely. I think it's another great example of how we almost kind of, as Anglo-Western academics, we make assumptions about how our understanding is the same as everybody else's in the world, whereas in fact we're kind of talking to ourselves a lot of the time, and we really need more people from different parts of the world to come in and give their perspectives, don't we? There is some opening up of the ideas of international education in different parts of the world, and I think it's becoming more, there are more and more examples of it, but it needs to be brought out to great extent, and for people like us, and those of us who are in an Anglo-Western context, to be aware that people don't always share our assumptions. This is quite interesting. And a number of people in my conversations have talked about this.
And that's also why we purposefully said we want to have case studies in our book Yeah, so we talk about the theory and the literature that's there, and about the research that we've been doing, but we want to have really people in there who say different things, who have a different voice, and whose voices are usually not heard because they don't speak our language.
Mm.
And then we try to miss it. And I think for me that is so important, that we try to listen to other things than that we know. And that's what I tell my students as well. Sort of, and if I can give you another example from my sustainability course, is that what people do in the pro camp of climate change, they look for arguments that that convince and confirm their own point of view, and the anti-climate change people look for arguments that confirm their point of view. And then I ask the student, what happens when they start communicating?
Mm.
And this is exactly also what you have when you have culturally different perspectives in a classroom, or when you have differences of opinion between whatever nations, people, political parties.
Yeah,
People don't want to listen to what is not convenient to them. So I think we
absolutely.
need to start looking for the inconveniences in conversations and
Yeah,
see what can we learn from it.
yeah. Well, it's been great talking to you about all of this, Jeanine. Thank you so much for taking the time today. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the book when it comes out. And I'll put a reference to it, obviously, with the video. But thanks very much for the conversation today.
And thank you for
Great to
inviting
see
me. I
you.
really enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Thank you.